Want to keep your personal number private but still stay connected? With Line 2, you can get a second phone line right on your device with a super simple app and no need for another phone. Whether it's for online shopping, dating, or shielding your main number from spam, Line 2 is an easy way to manage it all. Ready for peace of mind without breaking the bank? Call, text, block, and more for only $9.99. Get started with line2.com/audio or download Line 2 in any app store today. Line 2, your second line simplified.
Did you know that a polar bear's skin is black? Yeah, black. Did you know that the white fur you see is actually translucent and it turns yellow when it's been in the sun for a period of time? Now, me being me, I'm kind of thinking, suntan? Anyways, in today's episode, Dr. Stephen Amstrup, he's the chief scientist for Polar Bear International. He joins me. Now, he's a world-renowned expert on everything polar bears. Now, aside from the obvious, I started thinking about what was happening to the polar bears since the ice cap, their favorite habitat, is shrinking. I really wanted to learn more about what was happening with polar bears. So trust me, we really get into that and so much more. Now, here's a new term I learned. Paglophilic. Now it means ice living. Pretty cool. Do you catch the pun? Anyways, did you know that polar bears' claws, they're curved? Now that makes it easier for them to grab the ice and pull themselves out of the water, and it also helps them catch seals, which is their favorite meal. Now polar bears are the largest land carnivores, and they're also called white bears and sea bears. Now here's a crazy tidbit. They've been known to swim up to 400 miles over multiple days. Now here's even crazy with one. One bear was recorded to swim for 9 straight days. Now think about that. 9 days in freezing water. Crazy, right? Anyways, with climate change, the polar bear population is declining and they're also being forced to live in the land more and more. Now that kind of makes me really sad. Now, there's so much more in this episode, and Polar Bear International is doing incredible things to help protect these big guys. So sit back and get ready. Stephen's about to tell us so much about these incredible, fascinating animals, and he's going to make you love them even more.
For real, 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 for real. Got a bunch of furry friends and I love them all the same. I'm an animal lover, veterinarian is the name. Let's share some pet stories from heartwarming to strange. Losses and games from wacky to insane. For real. You're now tuned in to For Real with your host, Mark Kyle.
Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the For Real podcast. Today, my guest is Dr. Stephen Amstrup, and one of his key things, he's one of the few people that's been bitten by a polar bear and a fairy penguin, and we're going to get into it. Hey, Stephen, welcome to the show.
Hey, Mark, thank you very much for having me.
Well, I'm excited to have you here for a lot of reasons. Obviously, you're an expert in polar bears, but I also want to get into the fairy penguin thing here in a second. But ideally, what I think we do is, let's start with you, how you got to where you are today. Let's go early on, where you study in school and how it brought you to polar bears.
Well, I have had a fascination with bears for my whole life. And in fact, when I was 5 or 6 years old, I made the decision I wanted to go into the woods and study bears. And, that persisted. And I managed to do my master's research at the University of Idaho on black bears. And I went from there to working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, taking over what had been a floundering polar bear research project in Alaska. And so I went up to Alaska in 1980 to take the project over. But in the intervening years, I studied sharp-tailed grouse and pronghorn antelope. So I've had a little bit of diversity in that in the species that I've worked with.
So where were you in Alaska?
I was stationed in Alaska. The Alaska Science Center was in Anchorage, but all of my work was on the north slope of Alaska in the Arctic, because that's where the polar bears are.
Well, I know when we talked before, we talked about that, but coincidentally, and I think we talked about this, I was in Anchorage in 1980 myself.
Yeah, I remember that.
And I think we shared all the bars there because I knew where all the bars were for sure because that's not much more to do up there during the nighttime.
Yeah, and I was wondering why you didn't stop in and say hi.
Well, I should have. You know, the crazy thing when I was there, well, I was there. I just was with somebody else probably. But the crazy thing I remember from that, and of course, you're typical me, not on our subject, but you'd go into the bar, it'd be light out, and because I was there during the summertime, and you'd leave and it'd still be light out. It was the craziest thing.
Yeah, well, my first trip to Alaska, I had the experience. I wanted to stay up till they closed the bars, which was 5 in the morning,
Right.
and they had to close for 2 hours a day. That was the legal thing. And it's not like I was a big drinker or anything, but I just thought, wow, this is amazing. And so a colleague of mine and I, he lived there, so he had experienced it before, but he helped me experience it. And we went to the bar and had a few beers, had some French fries or whatever, and we stayed until they closed. And it was, last call was at 5 in the morning.
I totally remember that. I'd forgotten about that. But you have all those guys that work on the slope and all that too, because they're channeling in at different times and have different hours of work too. So it makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's no longer that way, but
Oh, really?
back in those, yeah, it's changed since then. They have more like normal bar and lounge hours these days.
Well, yeah, I've been up a few times, mainly to go fishing. I was up there on Peninsula, Kenai Peninsula, going halibut fishing. And then I can't remember where we were, but I was fly fishing for salmon and stuff up there too.
Yeah.
So let's get back to polar bears. So you go up to Alaska to study polar bears, and let's kind of talk a little bit about that experience and then get into polar bears.
Yeah, well, it was the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had been kind of struggling to put together a polar bear research program through the 70s. And in 1979, I was actually asked if I would be willing to go up to the North Slope and get a project really going, which was, I thought, holy cow, giant white bears roaming around on an environment that looks like the surface of the moon. What could be more exciting than that, And so pick me.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so that's when it started for me. It was in 1980, and I was in charge of polar bear research in Alaska until I retired from the USGS in 2010. And that's kind of an interesting story in itself. I started my career with the Fish and Wildlife Service, but the research functions of the Fish and Wildlife Service were transferred to the USGS in the mid-90s. And, that was an interesting thing. My colleague, George Durner, who worked with me for many years up there, he and I were up on the slope when they made that change. And we woke up in the morning and thought, oh, we're now part of the USGS. Maybe we should go out and see if we can find some rocks.
Yeah, exactly.
But
So when you first started, had you studied bears at all at that point? I know you were doing other animals.
yeah, well, I did my master's research at the University of Idaho on black bears. And I spent a couple of years in central Idaho doing studies and movements and distribution of black bears. And so at that time, I was the only person in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that had active research experience on bears.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's part of the reason that I was accepted to go up and see if I could get the polar bear research project going, because at least I knew something about some kind of bears.
Right. So when you're there, let's talk about, and I want to get into, very characteristics and everything about polar bears, but let's do that in a second. So when you're studying a bear, what is an average day that you're actually doing? What are you doing?
Well, the polar bear research is different than a lot of things, but just imagine that all of the bears live out on the sea ice.
Right.
And of course, we live on land. And so polar bear research has always been supported by aircraft. We went out every morning. We would fly out from a base of operations, which was typically the community of Barrow, now called Utqiagvik, or Prudhoe Bay, or the
Sure.
village of Kaktovik on the North Slope of Alaska. we would be housed there and have our helicopter base there, and we would go out every day, fly out over the ice looking for bears. And if we saw a bear, we would shoot it with a dart gun, that a dart containing an immobilizing agent, and the bear would uh, go to sleep. And then we could begin our work, weighing, measuring, putting ear tags on, radio collars, that sort of thing. I was the first person to successfully radio collar polar bears, which polar bears have kind of been an interesting challenge in those early years for putting radio collars on, because if you look at the profile of a polar bear compared to the other bears, they've got a really tapered form from their shoulders to their nose.
Right.
And especially the big males, their necks are bigger than their heads.
Oh.
And so it's hard to get a radio collar to stay on. And in fact, we still can't get radio collars on male bears. But if you're very careful, you can find just the right dimension that a female will hold the collar. And so a lot of my early work was figuring out how to get them collared and then following them around after that. But the daily routine was you go out, you catch bears, you get all these measurements, you get all these blood samples and fur samples and things like that. You come back to the base camp, and then you sort through everything and make sure it's ready to take back down to our labs in Anchorage for analysis.
So one of the things that when I was reading about this, so I could have something to talk to you about, because I mean, I know what polar bears look like and that, but I didn't know that much about them, is that the females are a lot smaller than the males. Is that true?
Yes. Yeah, they have a great degree of sexual dimorphism. So adult males typically can weigh twice as much as adult females, and they're very, very obviously different when you see them out on the ice. Now, the young bears, a young male might look very similar to a female, but once they're adults, their size difference is very great. Probably as great as certainly any other North American mammals, anyway, or greater.
So let's talk size. Let's talk about males, how big they are, how much they weigh, and then females too. How big are they?
Well, adult males.
I mean, they're big.
Yeah, adult males can they can be 10 feet long or more when they're. So you can imagine that a big male could probably reach up and grab a basketball hoop. Very large animals. They have necks the size of like 45 or 50-inch neck.
Wow.
Adult male, you could certainly put your head in its mouth if you wanted to.
I don't think so.
They have feet the size of platters, and they're pretty impressive creatures. But one of the things that's really interesting about them is how small they start out. These really big, impressive carnivores start out really small and vulnerable.
Like how small?
Well, when they're born, bears have a very interesting reproductive strategy. The female is bred in the spring and early summer, but the fertilized egg gets stalled in the fallopian tube of the female and doesn't actually implant until fall when the females go into their dens. And then the cubs are born about the first of the year, and they're born at just a couple of pounds. They look kind of like about the size of a guinea pig.
Really?
They're hairless. They're blind. Initially, they're totally helpless. But the strategy is that rather than carry an animal inside until it grows into to the status that it can move around with the female bear, her strategy is she gives birth to a very undeveloped cub and then nurses it with incredibly rich milk. And then so it's after birth that they grow very rapidly. And by the time they leave the dens in late March, April, this time of year, Polar bear cubs can be 25 pounds, something like that. And that's what we typically think of as baby bears. But when they started out, they're
Right.
they're very different than that. And then they can grow quite rapidly after, if the female continues to be well nourished and provides good milk, they can grow very rapidly.
Do polar bears hibernate?
They go into a den for an extended period, but there's still some debate about should we really call what bears do hibernating. If you think of small mammals like ground squirrels that hibernate, their body temperature drops down to about freezing. And if you pick up a hibernating ground squirrel, it's like dead.
Right.
Polar bears don't go into that degree of torpor. Well, actually, none of the bears do. They're relatively able to come alert and defend themselves if there's a threat at the den, and they don't lower their temperature near as much. Now, is the fact that their temperature doesn't drop like it does in small mammals, is that just a factor of their body size? Because it takes a lot longer for a large body to cool out than it does a smaller body.
Right.
That's not really clear, but there are some really important differences that I think make the process of denning that bears go through very special. And that is, they go into a den in the fall and they come out in the spring, but during that period, they haven't eaten anything. They haven't had any liquid. They don't urinate. They don't defecate. Whereas small mammals like ground squirrels, they will periodically arouse from that state of torpor that's very deep. They'll wake up periodically during the period of the winter, and they'll drink a little bit or eat a little snow or whatever, and they urinate and defecate. So, they go through a process of reducing their temperature to a much greater level, but some of their physiology is actually not as remarkable as a bear. I mean, think about several months in a den without eating or drinking or urinating or defecating. That's a pretty special process.
Well, I know they have a real thick layer of fat, so their body's feeding off that fat when they're there. Is that what happens?
Yes, that's right.
And do the babies just feed off of them when they're in there, when they're just laying around?
Yeah, so once the young are born, they spend a lot of time nursing, and female polar bears produce a milk that's 40% or more milk fat, and so those babies can grow very rapidly once if the female's in good enough shape to nurse, the baby bears grow really rapidly.
So again, just I'm trying to visualize this. So the female bear is in there, kind of in a trance, I guess is a good word for using it. I know you were saying Tupper, but they're kind of in a trance. And they're just laying there where the cub, I guess they're called at that point, is just going up there and feeding off them. Are they moving around at all?
Well, they don't move very much at first because they're largely immobile, I think, unable to move very much, but they certainly can find the nipples on the mother bears and start to nourish themselves. And so probably the first few weeks, they don't move much at all. But interestingly, we've explored numerous dens of polar bears, and polar bears dig their dens over most of their range. They're denning entirely in snow. So they wait until the drifts come, the snow comes in the fall and builds up drifts, and then they'll open up a little snow cave, basically, and then over the winter they get covered by more and more snow. But in those dens, you'll see often a kind of a main chamber and then a lot of little side tunnels that clearly the cubs have been doing that once they got old enough and big enough and strong enough to move around on their own. Then they're exploring right away and they're digging tunnels and things like that. So some of the dens were really pretty complicated, and it was clear looking at them that only the cubs could have made those little tunnels.
So when they're in their own little igloo snow cave, does that get covered? And how do they get oxygen if it gets covered?
Well, there's a fair amount of air that can actually circulate through the snow. It used to be that people thought that polar bear dens that polar bears continued to survive in under the snow by digging a little vent hole.
Mm-hmm.
And some dens do, in fact, have a vent hole, but it's probably caused by escaping heat and gases and not by the bears actually actively opening it up.
Okay.
It appears that for the most part they get enough air through the snow to be able to breathe. It's not like they're crushed by the snow. There's some space in there,
Right.
and they do now. If you can imagine a warm animal in a snow cave for the whole winter, an ice layer builds up
Yeah.
on the inside, and they do claw that away. So that may be the strategy that even though they may not dig all the way to the surface, they claw that ice layer away, which probably allows for greater gas exchange.
So when they're in their den now, and that's just the female and the baby. Where's the male during this time?
Well, the males have done their job in the spring.
Right. Okay.
So they maintain an active lifestyle out on the sea ice, and in fact, that is one thing that's different about polar bears and their denning than the other members of the bear family. For black bears and brown bears, they feed on plants, they feed on fish, they'll catch animals that they can. And most of the things that they eat, however, are not very available in the wintertime. When the snow is deep, vegetation is unavailable. The fish aren't running in the streams, And so for black bears and brown bears, denning, going into a den in the fall when the snow falls and not coming back out until the spring, is a foraging strategy.
Oh.
There's not much for them to eat during that time. But polar bears feed exclusively or almost exclusively on seals that they catch from the surface of the sea ice. And those seals are theoretically available year round or whenever there is ice available. And so, other than pregnant females that are in their dens, either pregnant or giving birth, they're the only class of polar bear that dens for the extended winter. The rest, or for an extended period during winter, the rest of them are out on the sea ice foraging.
Wow, that's crazy. One of the things I read was that they really don't have any predators other than another polar bear, of course, humans, but forgetting that. But in the wild, the only time they ever have another predator is a polar bear itself that may be undernourished or something like that.
Yeah, that's probably largely true. It has been documented that wolves will periodically kill polar bears, especially their cubs.
Yeah.
Wolves are really effective predators when they're hunting as a pack, and you can imagine a female bear has emerged from her den with her little cubs, and she's heading for the sea ice, and the wolves cross their path. A pack of wolves can pick off the cubs pretty quickly, and they're pretty impressive. They could, I suppose, kill adult females occasionally, although I imagine that doesn't happen very often. That's a pretty impressive predator to be taking on. But so wolves can be predators, and under the right circumstances, grizzly bears could kill them. Grizzly bears typically are much smaller, but under the right circumstances, they could kill a polar bear, a big grizzly bear and a small polar bear. So there are some things, but typically the biggest predator on polar bears is humans.
And then the other cool thing is too, humans are usually everybody's biggest predator, but even ourselves. But they're the biggest land carnivore that exists, basically, right?
Yeah, and that's what they're often referred to as, but I call them a non-aquatic predator, the largest non-aquatic predator, because they live out on the sea ice. So they're really not spending the vital parts of their life cycle. They don't spend on land. They spend it out on the sea ice where they can hunt. And so they don't, they can swim for sure, but they aren't aquatic like a seal. So, I like to think of them as the largest non-aquatic predator rather than the largest land predator.
Well, what I read was that they're actually considered a marine animal, and there's another side note to that. But yeah, when you talk about it, they said what I read again. We're using the internet. I'm not the guy like you that's lived in Alaska with it forever, but they call them the largest land carnivore. But then they turn around and they call them the marine animals. So they're kind of in between the two.
Well, yeah, I mean, they certainly do spend some time on land.
Right.
For the most part, dens are on land, for example. But the reason that they're called marine mammals is because they derive all of their sustenance from the sea.
Right.
There's very little, they have evolved to eat seals, they can be 50% fat by body weight. Very, very rich food source. It's that rich food source that has allowed them to become the largest bears in the world. But they catch those seals from the marine environment, and the seals, of course, are a product of the marine environment. So polar bears are called marine mammals because of that dependence on the ecosystem of the sea.
Well, I did an episode on the sea wolves. I think we talked a little bit about that, and Canada's calling it Canada's marine animal because 80% of the food they get is from the sea as well.
Yeah, well, I think that as we learn more and more about what animals do out there, we encounter more and more surprises.
I think, well, both of them are really cool species, regardless of the fact. So let's talk a little bit more characteristics of the polar bear. One is how fast. I know they're pretty fast on land. How fast can they run?
Well, the largest males aren't as fast as the younger ones, as the younger bears, but they can run 30 miles an hour in a short burst. I always like to say they can run a lot faster than we can, especially on the slippery surface of the sea ice. But they don't typically run for long periods. But one of the things that is interesting is they walk a lot, and they cover thousands of miles in the course of their annual activity of hunting. And some of them have activity areas that are immense. We've had polar bears that I've followed by radio telemetry that had activity areas 600,000 square kilometers.
How many?
600,000.
Oh my God.
Yeah, bigger than the state of Montana. They're incredibly can be incredibly mobile, and they spend a lot of time wandering around at kind of a sustained walking pace. They don't typically move really rapidly unless they're being chased by something. But they move a lot, I guess is what I'd say.
Yeah. Well, it seems like, when I've seen documentaries of it seems like they're in perpetual motion all the time.
Yeah, that's, I don't know if perpetual is the right word, but they're almost always moving. They certainly rest like everything else, but
sure.
If you look at where they are one place and where they are another, it's like, wow, they got here pretty quick.
Well, perpetual, that's my word. Obviously, it's never going to be the right word I'm saying it. But the one thing you mentioned, what I read, and you mentioned earlier, they have really big feet. And one of the reasons why they have big feet is because they're walking on ice all the time.
That's right. Yeah, they have really big paws, and their paws sometimes, well, in the wintertime, often their paws are covered with fur, which probably helps them get a better grip on the ice.
Mm-hmm.
And underneath the fur, the pads have, little papillae, little bumps that probably give them a better purchase on the snow and ice. And their claws, polar bears are very closely related to grizzly bears, but if you look at the claws of a grizzly bear, they're long and only slightly curved and well designed for digging. Grizzly bears spend a lot of time digging in the dirt and looking for small mammals that might be down there. Polar bears don't do that much digging, and their claws are sharp and curved, more like a black bear claw, only larger. And those sharp claws give them a real good purchase on the ice.
I read that. I'm so glad you brought that up because I thought it was such an interesting point is that if they're in the water, they've got these curved grappling hooks basically for things that they can pull themselves out of the water too, which is really cool.
Yeah, and they can pull themselves out of the water surprisingly rapidly. You think you're wet, you're grabbing onto a wet surface at the edge of an opening in the sea ice, and but they just pull themselves right out like nobody's business.
And we'll be right back. We are supported by PrepVet, providing stem cell therapy for pets.
As a pet lover, did you know your pet can benefit from the incredible healing power of stem cell therapy? Prep Therapy offers a groundbreaking solution taken right from your pet's own blood. Say goodbye to joint pain, arthritis, kidney and liver conditions, and more. They'll experience faster recovery, increased vitality, and extended quality of life without the need for surgery or harmful drugs. Put the wag back in their tail and discover Prep Therapy today at PrepVet.com. Save 10% with promo code FurRealPodcast, covered by most pet insurance.
Let's talk now about their swimming capabilities. I was blown away by that.
Yeah, polar bears, I think historically, they definitely have to swim in order to be able to live in the sea ice environment.
Right.
And so if there's an opening in the sea ice, they can swim across it and get to the other side. And I think that they've always done that. But one of the things that we've seen recently with the human warming of the world is that there's more and more big stretches of open water that they have to contend with. And, we've seen swims of 500 kilometers or more.
Right.
And, I don't think that that's good for them. In fact, the record swim is still one that we recorded back in the early 2000s, I guess it was, of a bear that swam something like 500 kilometers from the shore of Alaska out onto the sea ice and then made a long hike to the east along the edge of the sea ice. Well, that bear, when it made that long swim, it lost its yearling cub.
Wow.
And we don't know exactly when during that swim, but, a mother bear might be able to swim for a long distance like that, but the young bears can't. And she lost about 30%, I think it was, of her body weight while she was making this incredible trip. So the very, very long swims are possible, but that doesn't mean that it's good for them.
Well, they're trying to adapt to the environment. We're going to get there, and when they do those swims, I think it's the one I may have read about that 500 kilometer was like a 9-day swim, 9 days.
That's right. Yeah. That was one that we documented in northern Alaska years ago, and there's probably other bears that are doing that, but we just happen to be lucky and have one of our radio collar bears do it, so we can say, "Oh, wow."
I can't imagine being in the water for 9 days. And that's a good segue into, let's talk about their hair or their fur and some of the reasons why they have that guard hair or guard fur or whatever, but go when whatever the stuff is below that and go from there and talk a little bit about the characteristics of that stuff.
Yeah, well, they have like a lot of mammals, they have a long guard hair and then an under fur under that. And it's the under fur that probably provides the most warmth. The guard hairs are just that. They protect that more fragile under fur so it doesn't easily get damaged. The guard hairs are really interesting in that, and perhaps all of them are, but polar bear hair has a hollow medulla, a hollow center.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not like the hollow hairs that you see on a caribou. Caribou it almost looks like tiny soda straws where they're open on the end. Polar bear hair comes to a point, but it does have a hollow core. And so that might provide a little bit of additional warmth. It has been thought that, maybe maybe that hollow core transmits light or whatever, or solar energy. It doesn't seem like that's really the case. The science suggests that that's not true. But nonetheless, they have these hollow hairs. An interesting phenomenon about the hollow hair is that if polar bears are kept in captivity and the water quality isn't the greatest, they can actually have algae get into those hollow cores of the fur. So if you can imagine a polar bear on a cement surface or a rough surface, it's not its natural environment. The edges of the hair, the sides of a shaft of hair can be abraded and allow for algae cells to penetrate into the center of the hair. And this can result in the phenomenon of what has been titled as the greening of polar bears in zoos.
It's like a sloth.
Yeah.
I mean, they have moss that grows on those sloths and everything. It's crazy. I think that's just because they walk so slow, but they move so slow.
Yeah. They can't keep ahead of the algae.
And the other thing, and I want to get into the color and of a variety of things on that, but they also on water, they actually, I think you and I talked about this. I believe it was about polar bears. They drank salt water, but the body's able to filtrate the salt out and get the water. Is that right?
No, I don't. I mean, I imagine that they do drink some salt water, but they're drinking salt water in any great quantity wouldn't be good for polar bears or anybody else.
Okay.
But they're living in an environment that is covered typically by snow for much of the year,
Okay.
and so they can eat the snow. And there's on top of the sea ice, there are melt pools of melting snow. And multi-year ice has leached over the process of aging. Most of the salt has leached out of that old ice, and so when it melts, it's fresh water.
Okay.
In fact, historically in northern villages, the native people would collect their drinking water by going out and finding multi-year chunks of ice and bring it in and melt it. And it's actually very fresh and very good. So polar bears are drinking, fresh water.
Okay. So they don't have to worry about yellow snow and stuff like that. Okay. Let's talk about their, first of all, let's talk about their skin color, which I didn't even realize. Of course, I've seen their nose. And let's talk about their white fur and what happens when they're in the sun and that. I just think that's really interesting.
Well, yeah. So polar bears have black skin, which is really, really interesting. And you wouldn't think of a bear that has, or an animal that has white fur to have black skin. It has been hypothesized that maybe the hair, as I mentioned this earlier, that the hair might transmit solar energy to that black skin. That doesn't seem to be the case, but nonetheless, the black skin probably is an advantage and an attribute that they have picked up over time in their evolution to protect them from being out in a very bright environment. So the Arctic is dark for much of the year, but it's also light for much of the year. And even though the solar angle is not very high, there's a lot of sunlight out there, and it potentially could be warming up their skin, either from the direct solar radiation or radiation that's bounced off of the snow and ice.
Right.
So it's an interesting phenomenon. Now, if you look, like at a grizzly bear or a black bear, they certainly don't have black skin. So something happened there that caused polar bears to take on that skin color.
Unless you've ever seen them like you've seen them, you'd never know they have black skin because they're known for being white. But the white is, and again, I know you kind of talked a little bit earlier, there's some theory that it's not having pigment or something in there. Is that?
That's right. Yeah. Polar bear hair is really not white. There's no white pigments in there. It looks white because it reflects the white light of the environment. And so in early morning light, late evening light, you can see polar bears that can take on kind of a pink or an orange hue, just because that's what the color of the light is at that time of day.
Right.
And so, yeah, they are without pigment, but what you see is that as they go through their yearly cycle, they molt like other mammals, and so they start at the end of the molt in the spring and summer. They start with very, very white appearance, but then by autumn and in the winter, when they've been catching prey and there's blood and there's other sources of pigment in the environment, that gets onto the hair, soils the hair, and then they look kind of yellowish. In fact, I remember giving talks at schools years ago, and I would bring a polar bear skin. And I remember kids asking, "Why is it so yellow? I thought polar bears were supposed to be white." And so, yeah, the fur is like any other white or without pigment surface would take on pigments pretty readily. And so if they get into something that stains their fur, it might stay with them for quite a long while.
Yeah, the way I read it is that, and that I always want to believe what I'm going to believe, not the science. So I had read that when they're on the land, not on the ice, is that when they're in the sun for a long time, that starts turning yellow. But that makes more sense if they're getting other, elements on their skin, or their fur, to change that, I guess.
Yeah, and if they're on land, they're swimming in tundra ponds and they're exposed to mud, and they're on a beach that might be sandy, dirty, and so they can look pretty dirty, pretty dark at times when they've been on land. But even those that are out on the ice, there's algae in the water, there's algae on the ice. The underside of sea ice is covered with algae, and so if those cakes of ice get flipped over and a bear encounters them, there's a source of staining of the fur from that.
Hey, by the way, I learned a new word when I was reading. I was saying pegla, as in if I probably pronounce it wrong, peglophilic, which means ice living. Is that pronounced right?
Pegophilic, yes.
Yeah, it's a new term for me, a peglophilic. I love the name, and because it kind of goes along. What's interesting when I was reading about all the different names they've been called over the years, from polar bear to white bear to sea bear to whatever I guess maybe ice bear too. I mean,
yes,
they've been called all these crazy names. Oh, I know one thing I wanted to ask you. So one of the things I read, I know their closest sister is the brown bear, but they do interbreed with grizzlies and browns. What do they call them when they interbreed?
Well, a hybrid. There's been a lot, Pisley, Growler, but it turns out that so there's two pieces to that are, I think, important to take home. One is that recent genetic studies have shown that polar bears and grizzly bears separated from a common ancestor sometime between 250,000 years and 1,000,000 years ago. I don't know how. It depends on which study you've read, what the latest consensus seems to be. But since their separation, there has been apparently some episodes of interbreeding between them. So there's a genetic record of that modern molecular genetics has been able to kind of sort out. But in terms of human observations of that, there's a very limited sample, and from far northwestern Canada, right adjacent to the Alaska border, there have been a few bears that have been killed or observed and sampled that are hybrids. And it turns out, though, that is a relatively small number of bears. I think it's 7 or maybe 8 bears now. I'd have to go back and reread the paper.
Oh, wow.
But it is the result of, I think, one or two different females having bred, female polar bears having bred with male grizzly bears. So it's a very small thing, and it's very interesting, and it's the kind of thing that the general public really wants to glom onto. That, oh wow, they can actually interbreed. Well, we've known they can interbreed from records in zoos, because back years ago it was fairly common for zookeepers to put grizzly bears and polar bears together. And sometimes they would breed and produce successfully produce offspring. So we knew it could occur, but did it occur in the wild? It was discovered first several years ago when a trophy hunter in Canada shot what he thought was a polar bear. He was on a polar bear hunt,
Right.
and then they looked at it closely, and he and his Inuit guide looked at it and said, yeah, this looks a little bit different. And so they had it tested, and sure enough, turned out it was a hybrid. And since then, there have been a few others in this one area. It seems like there was, a couple of females and a couple of males that had the opportunity to breed and to interbreed, and that's what resulted. But what's, I think, the greater take-home message is that this is not a common phenomenon, and it is not the salvation of polar bears.
Yeah. Well, is it similar to, when a zebra and a horse, they've got a breed called a Zorse, right?
Yeah.
But that, once they have that, they're not fertile. They can't have another one. Is that similar with these guys? Have they seen that they've had another one or not?
Hybrid bears can produce fertile offspring.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
So that's a different thing.
Okay, so now I've got some I want to get into some science and get into the environment. So one question I have for you is, when you read about this, it doesn't give you a real number of how many polar bears are out there. And I know there's all these different things we talked a little bit about. Can you get into the population of polar bears and some of the things that come out?
Well, one of the big challenges in polar bear science has been estimating how many bears might be out there. We talked about the fact that we humans live on land, and we venture out onto the sea ice. Native people of the north, the Inuit, have been going out and hunting polar bears for around 10,000 years. So there is that business of humans that live on land venturing out onto the ice, but the polar bears live out there.
Right.
And so it's been really challenging to come up with good numbers. And one of the things that we hear about is, oh, well, it looks like there's more bears now than there used to be, because the most recent estimates from the Polar Bear Specialist Group, which is the community of people around the world who study and manage polar bears, the most recent estimates are around 26,000 bears. But I'm going to give you some caveats on that estimate in a moment. But in the 50s and 60s, when people first really became interested scientifically in polar bears, we just didn't know how many there were. And there were some really crude estimates that were thrown around. There was a Soviet scientist who did some aerial surveys and estimated that there may only be 5,000 polar bears in the whole Arctic. So some people will say, oh, well, look, there was only 5,000 back then, and now there's 25,000. Look at how they've grown. But what's really grown is our understanding of where they live, how they live, and how many are out there. And so what we've got now, there's 20 different subpopulations of polar bears around the Arctic. Polar bears have a circumpolar distribution. So if you look at the world from the top, look down on the North Pole, there's kind of like a ring of polar bears all the way around. And most of those bears are concentrated in the near shore parts of the Arctic Ocean, because those are the areas, the shallow water areas, are the most productive. But nonetheless, being near shore is not like being on shore in terms of trying to study them. But with those 20 subpopulations that we have, many of them are just still a mystery. In fact, of the 20 subpopulations, we have not enough information to provide any estimate at all. So we have kind of educated guesses of how many bears might be there. And that 26,000 that the International Polar Bear Specialist Group puts out as an estimate is really, it's a combination of a few subpopulations where we've got really good estimates and several populations where we got not such good estimates. And then half of them, we don't have estimates at all, but we've got educated guesses. But we know that there's way more than 5,000 polar bears. There were more than 5,000 polar bears in the 50s and 60s. And we just know a little bit more about how many there are.
Well, a couple things. One of the reasons I wanted other side that I'm fascinated by polar bears to begin with is, I was reading an article about how the ice is getting smaller and they have less land or less ice to live on. So I'm wondering if one of the reasons you're able to get a better number for the polar bears, aside from having science to do it, is that the massive area that they can actually look and study them is becoming smaller and smaller too. So you have a easier access to it. Is that possible too?
That's well. I'm gonna tell you no. That's not really the what's going on. In fact, in the southern Beaufort Sea of Alaska, where I did most of my research, the changes in the sea ice have made it more difficult to study the bears, because in order for to get out on the sea ice and sample the bears and observe them, it has to be safe for humans to be out there too.
Sure.
And so if the sea ice edge is farther away, there's a big open water, there's more open leads, it's less safe to be out there. The ice is thinner. It's less safe to land and work on the ice. So there are a lot of challenges. In addition to just the condition of the ice, the warmer environment lends itself to more what we would call bad weather: fog, snow, rain, conditions that make it difficult just to get out and do the work. Historically, when I first went to Alaska in 1980, it was cold for the whole period that I was up there. I could begin my work in the fall around the 10th of October, because by then it had been cold enough. We had about 10 inches of ice. We could go out and safely work on the ice. And it would be solid ice in the spring when we went back up to sample then. And you didn't really have to worry too much about, are we going to have to fly over too much open water? That's, if you have an engine failure and you're flying over open Arctic water,
right,
your survival is very unlikely.
Yeah.
That actually the decline of the sea ice, which I know we're going to be talking about more, but it has not made conditions, at least in most of the environment of the polar bear, it hasn't made conditions that much better for studying them. So, that's kind of a different situation.
Okay, so let's go from 1980 to 2025 and tell me what you've seen. When you read about the population, because they're vulnerable, because their population is going down according to that. I know we talked a little bit different on that. Is one of the reasons is because, of course, you've got humans that have always been a factor, but that's not the big factor. The big factor is the climate change. And of course, we talked a little bit about this, and I want to get into it, is the oil and gas industry, which is causing an effect. So can you really dive into that so people understand what we're doing that's affecting this species and, of course, others as well?
Well, we're so the short story is that humans have developed for the last 150 years or so a dependence on fossil fuels for our energy, and depending on fossil fuels has really allowed humans to flourish in a way that we wouldn't have been able to without them. But we've not been paying attention to the side effects. We haven't been paying attention to the trash, if you will, that is created when we burn fossil fuels. And that trash is the CO2 and other greenhouse gases that are emitted when we combust fossil fuels. And those gases trap heat in the they trap the sun's energy in the atmosphere and cause the world to warm. So the laws of physics require the world to warm as long as we continue to increase the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. That's an unavoidable consequence, and we haven't been paying attention to it. So we're way above what had been historic levels of greenhouse gases. And those gases have warmed the environment, which has resulted in declining sea ice, among other impacts. And, when I first went to Alaska in 1980, I could stand on the North Slope of Alaska looking out at the Arctic Ocean at the end of the summer. And typically I could see the sea ice, the edge of the sea ice, right just offshore, not very far. When I that was in 1980, the early 1980s. Most of the 80s were like that, where the ice remained very close to the shore. But by the time I left my research position in Alaska in 2010, standing on the shore at the same time of year, you couldn't see the sea ice. It had retreated far enough back that it was beyond the curvature of the earth. So you're just looking out there at open water. And if somebody had told me in 1980 that I was going to see that kind of a change
In your lifetime.
just in my working career, I would have told them they were crazy. But that's sort of a nutshell of what's causing the retreat and the impact of the retreat. And so I don't know where you want to go from here, but polar bears depend on that ice to catch their prey. There are some things on the land that polar bears can eat, and some of those things are relatively nutritious. But there's nothing really in most areas on land where polar bears live. There's nothing that is comparable to the richness of the seals that they catch out on the ice. And so, as the ice is away from the productive nearshore areas for longer and longer, as the ice is away for longer and longer, polar bears are either stuck on land or go way out into the deep polar pack where productivity is very low, where the remaining sea ice is. In either case, they are not able to feed. And so, the idea that people say, oh, well, polar bears will just move on to land and start acting like grizzly bears, or some people have suggested, oh, they'll be okay, they'll interbreed with grizzly bears, and that's a totally different thing. However, what we do know is that when the sea ice isn't available, polar bears are losing weight. And they can only lose so much weight. They can fast for a long time, but they can't fast indefinitely.
Right. Yeah. So that's, because one of the things that I'd read when you're talking about the seals, it's that blubber that they get from the seals in their diet that gives them the energy to be able to keep doing what they do.
That's right. What we imagine happened back historically when polar bears separated from a common ancestor with the current brown bear is that they saw an open niche out on the sea ice that, hey, there's all these, you can think of these seals, they could be 50% body fat. You think of them as giant fat pills out there on the ice that polar bears could go out there and start to catch. And so it was that very, very rich food that allowed polar bears to become the largest of the bears. And so there's, Mother Nature has given us some examples. If you look at northern Alaska, northern Canada, far northwestern Canada, where grizzly bears occur on shore right up to the Arctic Ocean, those grizzly bears that live on land are among the smallest of the brown bears around the world. They don't get very big. They reproduce very slowly, and they live at very low densities. So by contrast, the polar bears are the largest bears in the world. It doesn't seem to make much sense that we could move whole populations of the largest bears in the world into an environment that currently supports only small numbers of small bears.
Yeah.
And if you look back in time, we know that during the Pleistocene, 10,000 years ago and earlier, that the sea ice was far south compared to what it is now. The Earth was cooler. Polar bears lived farther south, and they lived even in the Baltic Sea near southern Sweden, Denmark, that area between Sweden and Finland. And so there is fossil record of polar bears living in that environment. But as the world warmed during the Holocene, those polar bears didn't figure out, when the sea ice was disappearing, they didn't figure out a way to move on to land or find some other way to make a living. They just disappeared.
Oh, wow.
So, we know from that history, it's unlikely that if we allow the sea ice to continue to disappear, that polar bears are going to disappear along with it.
So, along with the polar bears, I'm assuming the seal populations are probably going down as well. Is that true?
Well, I think that the answer to that, to a great extent, is that we don't really know for sure.
Okay.
So polar bears catch their prey, seals, from the surface of the ice. They very rarely might catch a seal in open water under the right circumstances, and that has been documented, but that is not the way that the populations are sustained. Polar bears catch their prey from the surface of the ice by stalking seals that are laying out to sun themselves in the spring,
Right.
or waiting at breathing holes for the seal to come up and breathe. But seals, they feed on the creatures that live under the ice and in the water, and so they actually can do pretty well living a pelagic existence, and that's how they do now in the summertime. Historically, when the sea ice has been absent, even though it was absent for shorter periods than now, they could maintain a pelagic environment and be okay.
Right.
A pelagic existence in that environment. Polar bears don't have that advantage. They can't go out there and swim after the seals.
Okay.
But so back to your question, how are the seals doing? Ringed seals are the most common prey of polar bears across their entire range.
Right.
And if you look up in the books about seals, looking for, well, how many ringed seals are there? Typically, they say numerous.
So a lot.
And so we don't really know for sure what the trends in ring seal populations are, at least globally. There may be some local populations where studies that I'm not aware of have documented trends one way or another. But we do know a few things, that there have been some studies that have shown that with the retreat of the ice, that ring seals tend not to do as well, because they forage to a great extent on the ecosystem that occurs on the underside of the sea ice.
Right.
Might be worthwhile to talk about that a little bit. Most people are familiar with the ice on a pond or a lake. And if you break off a chunk of that ice and flip it over, the bottom side looks about like the top. It's smooth,
Right.
it's glare, there's not much going on that underside. But salt ice is a different thing. The ice freezes, the water freezes when it's cold enough, forms ice. And as soon as it's formed, the ice starts to eject salt, brine, back into the water on the underside. And that creates kind of a little microcosm. You can think of it as kind of a mini mountain range on the bottom side of the sea ice. And that mountain range is rich in algae and fungi and small organisms that feed on those, shrimp-like creatures, and then fish. And the fish feed on that environment. And then the seals eat eat the crustaceans and the fish. And so that's the source of the ring seals' food. And they can catch things in the open water, but it looks like they do best foraging in that underside. So, as the sea ice goes away, we are seeing in some parts of the world that ring seals become unavailable, but other seals may move in for a while and take advantage of what now is an open niche. Another thing that we see with ring seals is that they give birth to their young in little subnivean or under snow caves. These are, you can think of a little snow cave that is above the surface of the sea ice and below the surface of the snow. The seals come in from the underside and open up these little caves, and that's where they give birth. But if there's not enough snow, they end up giving birth out in the open, and the survival of ring seal pups out in the open isn't as great. And also, if it's warm, the snow that might normally be covering up these layers becomes rain, and rain can cause the layers to collapse, and that can also result in poorer survival of pups. So those are a couple of things related to warming that suggest to us that ring seals probably will not do very well if the sea ice is gone for too long. But exactly how that's impacted them to this point isn't entirely clear.
Well, that's because there's numerous of them.
Yeah, that's because they're numerous. That's right.
Exactly. Okay, so what have we? I know there's probably 100 things. What have we not talked on that you want to get out there for the listeners today? And we can always do a follow-up one down the road on many other things. Is there anything we've missed that you think that we should cover just for people's listening thrill?
Well, the science of understanding what the impact of declining sea ice is on polar bears has really been advancing. And one of the things that we now know, and in fact, in my most recent publication, is going to be my last publication from 2023, we showed that the number of ice-free days that polar bears can't feed. So think of it as fasting days. When the ice is pulled away from the shore far enough that bears can't swim back and forth easily, and that there's no productive hunting available to them, that fasting period is the critical period that polar bears face in order to be able to reproduce successfully and survive. And what we were able to do is to link human emissions directly to ice-free days and then to the number of fasting days. And, it turns out that in Western Hudson Bay, the population of polar bears that we know the most about, the critical number of days that polar bears can be off of the ice without it having an impact on them is about 117 days of ice-free. And we're well beyond that now, although it varies from year to year, depending on sort of the natural chaos in the climate system. So it's not like every year is a really bad year, but there's been a higher frequency of bad years in Hudson Bay and in the southern Beaufort Sea. Both of those subpopulations now are about half of what they were just a couple of decades ago.
Wow.
And so the impact is clear, and the ability to understand what's causing that is clear. And there's a couple of recent papers that have come out, one in particular in Science, further documenting the linkage between the absence of sea ice, the length of time that polar bears are forced to fast, and the decline in their numbers.
So the maximum before current times was 1/3 of the year, basically. So now, what is it on average now?
Well, it varies a lot depending on where you are in the Arctic. So remember, we talked about how polar bears have a circumpolar distribution,
Right.
and in that area of ice that historically was covered by ice for long enough to support polar bears, there's a great variation in the condition of the ice, the movements of the ice, and that sort of thing. And so there's places where polar bears are already suffering, and that includes southern Hudson Bay and the southern Beaufort Sea. And then there are places where, it appears that maybe the polar bears are still doing okay, even though the ice may be less abundant. It's still abundant enough to support bears right now. But the track record seems to be pretty clear that as you remove sea ice and make it be gone forever longer, more and more of our 20 subpopulations are going to be facing periods of ice-free periods that are too long for them to sustain.
It's so sad in so many ways.
Yeah.
We do a great job with nature, don't we?
Well, we are capable of it, and the unfortunate thing is that that global warming is entirely a human-caused phenomenon, and it's something that we can do something about. There was a time when people weren't understanding it very well and weren't really understanding the significance of what us warming the world means. And there's a lot of people still who think that conservation is about biologists running out in the field with rubber boots and collecting data and, maybe setting up refuges and, putting fences around important habitats or whatever. That's what we used to think of as protective measures. But you can't build a fence to protect the sea ice from rising temperatures.
Right.
And that's where we are in a situation now that we just need to pay more attention to this phenomenon and arrest it. And we have the ability. We can pare back on our emissions. We can ultimately stop the growth of emissions in the environment, but we haven't been moving that direction.
Well, a lot of that has to do with greed, and I'm not going to get there. I'm not going to get there. But anyways, we're at the end of the show. So, and I hate to do this because this is when we tell a silly joke, and we're talking about a serious subject and telling a joke now. Not to belittle what we're just talking about, but as I always do at the end of every episode, is we always have a joke, and I always ask everybody, because I torture the guests to tell a joke if they will, and I do. But for you guys that are listening, if you have a niece, nephew, grandchild, your children, you want to tell a joke in the show, please do. Send me an email at mkyle@forrealpodcast, and we'll do this because I feel bad because I make the guests tell them, and when they will. And so to that extent, Stephen, it's your turn to tell your silly joke for the day.
Okay, well, so a polar bear walks into a bar and stands up at the bar. The bartender says, "What'll you have?" And he says, "I'll have a gin."
A gin? Oh. You there?
And tonic. And the bartender looks at him and says, "Okay, well, why the big pause?"
Ah, that's a good one. You got me asking you right away. I thought the sound that's even better. Anyways, most importantly, hey, Stephen, thanks so much for being on the show. I really, really appreciate it. And for you guys out there listening, always keep listening. Anytime you have an idea for an episode, please let me know. Keep following, tell your friends, because of you guys, I'm able to keep doing this thing. But I do respond to anybody that has an idea, again, or you want to be on the show, whatever. Please send me an email at mkyleforrealpodcast.com. Again, Stephen, thank you so much. And then for everybody else listening, always from the bottom of my heart, thank you for listening. For real.
That concludes this episode of For Real with your host, Mark Kyle. For previous and future episodes of For Real, listen via all major podcast streaming sites.
When it comes to Mother's Day, at Ritual, we believe in giving her flowers. But are flowers what she actually wants? We asked around, and flowers are fine, but most women would prefer science-backed gut support that never wilts. While we're at it, throw in Stress Relief, our chill pill designed with clinically studied forms of ingredients to reduce daily stress. Did we mention that all of our supplements are clean, vegan, and third-party tested for heavy metals and microbes? Because if you ask us, the thought counts, but traceable science and sourcing count more. Find your Ritual. Get what you really want this year, whether you're a mom or not, with 40% off your first month at ritual.com/podcast. That's RITUAL.com/podcast for 40% off your first month. These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
Hi, I'm Chris Gethard, and I'm very excited to tell you about Beautiful Anonymous, a podcast where I talk to random people on the phone. I tweet out a phone number, thousands of people try to call. We talk to one of them, they stay anonymous, I can't hang up, that's all the rules. I never know what's going to happen. We get serious ones. I've talked with meth dealers on their way to prison. I've talked to people who survived mass shootings. Crazy funny ones. I talked to a guy with a goose laugh, somebody who dresses up as a pirate on the weekends. I never know what's going to happen. It's a great show. Subscribe today, Beautiful Anonymous.